The sound of shattering wood filled the studio as Ethan slammed the violin against the edge of the desk. The delicate instrument splintered into jagged pieces, its strings snapping with a sharp twang that echoed through the room. Ethan's chest heaved, his face twisted in fury, his fists gripping the broken neck of the violin like a weapon. Across the room, Noah stood unfazed, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The dim studio lighting cast sharp shadows across his face, accentuating the smug grin that tugged at his lips. "What are you gonna do, kid?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Ethan glared at him, his eyes blazing with rage. He took a step forward, his shoulders squared as if ready to charge. "I'll do what you can't," he spat. "I'll protect her." "Protect her?" Noah scoffed, his laughter cold and biting. "From what? Me? You think you're some kind of hero?" He tilted his head, his expression darkening. "You're nothing but a pathetic little boy playing at being a man." Behind them, Lila's knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor. Her delicate hands covered her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her sobs were quiet but relentless, a stark contrast to the heated voices echoing above her. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice muffled by her trembling hands. "Please, both of you, just stop!" Neither man turned to her. Ethan's knuckles whitened as he threw the remains of the violin to the floor, the pieces scattering across the polished wood. "You don't deserve her!" he shouted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. Noah stepped closer, his smirk fading as his eyes narrowed dangerously. "And you think you do?" he growled, his tone low and menacing. "You think she'd choose you? A naive little student who doesn't even understand what real life looks like?" Ethan didn't back down, his body rigid with defiance. "At least I'd never hurt her," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "At least I wouldn't make her afraid to breathe." Noah's jaw tightened, his hand twitching at his side as if suppressing the urge to lash out. "You don't know a damn thing about us," he hissed. "This is my wife, my life. Stay out of it." Lila's sobs grew louder and she raised her tear-streaked face to look at them. Her voice broke as she pleaded, "Please, stop this. I can't take it anymore." Ethan glanced down at her, his expression softening for a fleeting moment, but the sight of her, broken, trembling, and caught between them, only reignited his fury. He turned back to Noah, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't deserve to call her your wife." Noah lunged forward, but Lila scrambled to her feet, throwing herself between them. "Enough!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. Her arms spread wide as if to physically hold them apart. "Ethan, please, leave." Ethan froze, his breathing ragged as he looked at her. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a flicker of heartbreak. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself. With a reluctant step back, he turned and strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As the door slammed shut behind him, the room was left in shambles. The shattered violin lay on the floor, a symbol of everything that had just been destroyed. Noah stood still, his fists clenched, while Lila collapsed onto a chair, her head in her hands as sobs racked her fragile frame. The air in the studio was heavy with tension, the silence broken only by the sound of Lila's quiet sobs. Noah took a slow, deliberate step toward Ethan, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the wooden floor. His smirk remained, cold and calculated, as if he were savoring the chaos he had orchestrated. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" Noah said, his voice low and dripping with mockery. His eyes narrowed, locking onto Ethan with an intensity that felt like a predator sizing up its prey. "What makes you think you can stand here in my studio and act like you belong?" Ethan didn't flinch, his jaw tight as he held Noah's gaze. "It's not about me," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "It's about her. She deserves better than this." Noah chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "And you think you're what she deserves? A boy who barely knows her, who doesn't have the faintest idea what it takes to keep a marriage together." He stepped closer, the smirk fading into something colder. "You have no idea what you're playing at." "Neither do you," Ethan shot back, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't love her. You control her. You break her." Lila, still crouched on the floor, forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her, and her shoulders shook with the weight of the moment. "Stop this," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She moved between them, her hands outstretched as if she could push them apart with sheer willpower. Please, stop. Noah ignored her, his gaze fixed on Ethan. You think you're a man, standing there, running your mouth? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You don't have what it takes to face me, boy. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Lila stepped forward, her voice breaking as she cried out, Ethan, please, leave. Her words hit him like a blow. He looked down at her, his fiery determination faltering when he saw the desperation in her tear-streaked face. Her hands trembled as she reached out to him, pleading. Please, she repeated, her voice trembling. This isn't your fight. Just go. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. His gaze darted between Lila and Noah, his mind warring with itself. He wanted to stay, to protect her, but the weight of her words and the exhaustion in her eyes told him the truth. She needed him to leave. Finally, with a shaky exhale, Ethan nodded. He turned toward the door, each step heavy with reluctance. As he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes met Lila's one last time, and in that brief moment, everything he wanted to say hung unspoken between them. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound echoed in the studio, final and absolute. Lila collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face as tears streamed freely. Across the room, Noah stood motionless, his smirk replaced by a look of quiet triumph. You see, he said, his voice calm but chilling. I always win. But Lila didn't respond. Her tears weren't for Noah. They weren't even for Ethan. They were for herself, for everything she had lost, and everything she was too afraid to fight for. The room felt colder now, suffocating in its silence, as the weight of what had just transpired settled like a stone in her chest. The warm glow of the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the small violin studio, casting golden patterns across the polished wooden floor. Lila stood at the front of the room, her hands gracefully guiding the bow of a young student's violin. Her voice, calm and patient, carried through the air. Good, she said gently, but keep your wrist relaxed. Let the bow flow naturally across the strings. The student nodded, their small hands trembling slightly as they adjusted their grip. Lila offered a soft smile, crouching slightly to meet their eye level. It's all about control without tension, she added, demonstrating the movement with her own bow. The sound of a perfectly drawn note filled the room, resonating warmly. Ethan, sitting quietly in the corner, couldn't take his eyes off her. He had joined the class only a few weeks earlier, and though his skill with the violin was modest, his fascination with Lila had grown immeasurably. It wasn't just her talent that captivated him. It was the way she carried herself, her grace, and the gentle strength behind her every word. As the lesson continued, Ethan's gaze lingered on the way her fingers moved effortlessly across the strings, her brow furrowing slightly in concentration. There was a light in her eyes when she taught, a spark that seemed to brighten the room. But there was also something else, something shadowed and hidden just beneath her composed exterior. When the lesson ended, the younger students began packing up their instruments, chattering as they left the studio. Lila stayed behind, tidying the music stands and gathering stray pieces of sheet music. Ethan hesitated for a moment before approaching her, holding his violin case. You're really good at this, he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. Lila looked up, startled at first, but then she smiled, a small, fleeting expression. Thank you, Ethan. You're improving too. He grinned awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. I have a long way to go before I can play like you. Her smile lingered for a second longer before she turned her attention back to the sheet music in her hands. Ethan opened his mouth to say more, but the sudden chime of a phone interrupted him. Lila's expression shifted immediately. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she glanced at the screen. A text message from Noah flashed across the screen. Why aren't you answering me? You're late. Her smile vanished. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a tightness in her jaw as she quickly turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into her bag. Ethan noticed the change, his brow furrowing in concern. Everything okay? He asked hesitantly. Lila forced a nod, avoiding his gaze. Yes, it's fine, she said quickly. I just have a lot on my mind. Ethan didn't press further, but the moment lingered between them, heavy and unspoken. He watched as she resumed tidying the room, her movements quicker now, more rigid. The warmth she had exuded moments ago seemed to have been snuffed out like a candle in a gust of wind. As Ethan packed up his violin and left the studio, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind her tired smile, one that she wasn't ready to share. And for the first time, he found himself wishing he could be the one to help her carry the weight of it. The soft sound of shuffling papers filled the empty studio as Lila moved between the music stands, collecting forgotten sheets of notes. The fading sunlight bathed the room in a warm amber hue, highlighting the curve of her shoulders and the precise, almost delicate movements of her hands. Ethan watched her from a distance, his violin case resting by his side, but his attention was fully on her. "You don't have to do all that by yourself," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though he feared disrupting the fragile calm that had settled over the room. Lila looked up, her expression momentarily surprised. "Oh, it's fine," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I do this every day." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Still, let me help. It's the least I can do after you've been so patient with me in class." She hesitated, her fingers clutching a stack of papers a little too tightly. For a moment, her lips curved into a faint smile, a gesture so brief that it felt more like a flicker of light than an actual expression. "All right," she said, almost reluctantly, as she handed him a few sheets. "You can put these on the piano." Ethan took the papers, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. The contact was fleeting, but it lingered in the air between them like a chord that hadn't fully resolved. He turned to place the sheets on the piano, glancing back at her as she busied herself straightening chairs. "You're really good at this, you know," he said casually. "Not just playing, but teaching. You make it look so easy." Lila paused for a moment, her hand resting on the back of a chair. She glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "It's not as easy as it looks," she admitted, a hint of vulnerability creeping into her voice. "But I've been doing it for a long time." Ethan smiled, his admiration evident. "It shows. You have this way of making people feel like they can actually get better." Her cheeks flushed faintly at his words, and she quickly turned away, focusing on aligning the chairs into neat rows. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. As the last chair was set in place, Lila glanced at the clock. "That's everything," she said briskly, her tone shifting back to professional detachment. "You should probably head home. It's getting late." Ethan nodded, though his feet didn't move right away. He lingered for a moment, watching her as she began gathering her things. "Good night, Lila," he said finally, his voice tinged with something deeper than politeness. "Good night, Ethan," she replied without looking at him. When the door closed behind him, Lila exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping as the tension of the moment left her. She turned toward the mirror hanging on the wall. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, guarded, and carrying a weight she couldn't name. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her face as she studied herself. The faint blush on her cheeks hadn't completely faded, and her lips trembled as though they wanted to say something she couldn't admit. For a brief moment, her composure cracked, and the weight of everything she had been suppressing flickered across her face. She turned away from the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and picked up her bag. As she walked out of the studio, the faint echoes of Ethan's words still lingered in the back of her mind, both a comfort and a complication she wasn't ready to confront. The kitchen was dimly lit, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Noah stood by the counter, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his face set in a cold, unreadable expression as his gaze flicked to the clock on the wall. The front door clicked open, and Lila stepped in quietly, her violin case hanging from one hand and her bag slung over the other. She froze when she saw him waiting, the weight of his stare stopping her mid-step. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice thin with unease. "Where were you?" Noah's words cut through the room like ice. He didn't move from his spot, his posture rigid. Lila placed her things gently by the door, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. "I had a late class," she replied softly, avoiding his gaze. It ran longer than usual. His lips curved into a humorless smile. A late class? He repeated mockingly. That's convenient. Her heart pounded as she moved further into the room, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. It's not unusual, Noah. Some students stay after for extra help. It's part of my job. Your job, he snapped, his voice rising. He took a step forward, his presence looming. And what exactly does your job involve these days? Staying late to help that boy? What's his name again? Lila's breath hitched, but she forced herself to respond calmly. Ethan is just a student, Noah, a very talented one who needs guidance. Noah slammed his hand onto the counter, the sound reverberating through the room. Lila flinched, her eyes darting to the impact. Don't lie to me, he growled, his voice filled with venom. I see the way he looks at you. Do you think I'm blind? Her throat tightened, and she struggled to maintain her composure. You're being ridiculous, she said, her tone wavering. He's just a student. There's nothing else. Noah leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, his eyes narrowing. If I ever find out there is, you'll regret it. Do you hear me? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let him see her cry. She nodded stiffly, her voice barely audible. I hear you. The silence between them was deafening as Noah straightened, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer before he turned away. Go to bed, he muttered coldly. Lila stood there for a moment, frozen in place, before she grabbed her things and retreated to the bedroom. Her chest felt tight. The words she wanted to say caught in her throat as the door closed behind her. Outside the studio earlier that evening, Ethan had stood in the shadows, watching through the window as Lila packed up her things. The faint glow of the studio's lights illuminated her figure, but something about the slump in her shoulders and the weariness in her movements struck him. As she left, her steps hesitant and her head down, he clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. From his vantage point, he could see the way her light dimmed when she walked away, as though she were carrying a burden too heavy for one person. The glass reflected his face, and in it, he saw not just concern, but an anger simmering just beneath the surface. A quiet, helpless fury he didn't know how to channel. The studio was quiet, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound as Lila sat on the edge of the piano bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The last student had left hours ago, but she remained, her shoulders slumped under the weight of emotion she couldn't suppress anymore. Her violin sat untouched on the stand, a silent witness to her turmoil. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim overhead light. He hadn't expected to find her still here, alone and vulnerable. Lila, he called softly, stepping into the room. She startled, quickly brushing her hands over her face to wipe away the tears she thought she'd hidden. Ethan, she said, her voice trembling. What are you still doing here? I forgot my book, he lied, his eyes fixed on her red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. He took a step closer, his concern evident. Are you okay? I'm fine, she replied too quickly, avoiding his gaze. It's just been a long day. He didn't believe her. Without a word, he crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench, leaving enough space to give her room, but close enough to show he wasn't going anywhere. From his pocket, he pulled a crumpled tissue and handed it to her. Her lip quivered as she took it, her fingers brushing against his briefly. She turned away, dabbing at her cheeks as fresh tears spilled over. I'm sorry, she whispered. You shouldn't have to see me like this. You don't have to apologize, he said gently, his voice low and soothing. Everyone has their breaking point. She shook her head, her shoulders trembling. I'm stuck, Ethan, she admitted, her voice breaking. I'm stuck in a nightmare I can't wake up from. No matter what I do, there's no way out. Her words cut through him like a blade. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening at the raw vulnerability in her voice. You don't deserve this, he said firmly, his tone filled with quiet determination. You deserve to be free, to be happy. She turned to look at him then, her eyes filled with both gratitude and pain. For a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink, the world outside the studio fading into nothingness. His hand inched closer, as if drawn by an invisible force, but he stopped himself before crossing the line. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head as she turned away. This isn't right. Lila, he began, But she cut him off with a trembling hand raised in the air, a silent plea. "No," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "You're kind, Ethan. You're good. But this is wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan lowered his hand, his chest aching as he watched her struggle to rebuild the walls she had let down, even if only for a moment. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be here if you need me." She nodded, but she couldn't meet his gaze. Instead, she stood, clutching the tissue tightly in her hand. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But I need to go." He watched her leave, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The quiet returned to the studio, heavier now than before. Ethan stayed on the bench, his hands clasped tightly together, as he stared at the door she had walked through. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like an unfinished melody, leaving him torn between hope and the harsh reality that some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how much his heart begged otherwise. The sharp rustling of paper filled the dimly lit study as Noah's hand tightened around a crumpled letter. His jaw clenched, the veins on his temples pulsing as his eyes scanned the neatly written words. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. Ethan's name, signed at the bottom, burned into his mind like a brand. He slammed the letter down onto the desk, his fist colliding with the wood with a loud thud. The sound echoed through the house, startling Lila in the adjoining room. She froze mid-step, her heart pounding as a sinking sense of dread washed over her. "Lila?" Noah's voice bellowed, sharp and commanding. Lila hesitated, gripping the edge of the doorway as she peeked into the study. The sight of him standing rigid by the desk, the letter clutched in his fist, sent a chill down her spine. His face was a storm of anger, his eyes dark and piercing as they locked onto hers. What's wrong?" She asked cautiously, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. "What's wrong?" he repeated mockingly, holding up the letter. This is what's wrong. Care to explain?" Lila's blood ran cold as her eyes darted to the letter. She recognized it instantly. Ethan's words of encouragement, written in a moment of kindness, had now become a weapon in Noah's hands. Her mouth went dry, and she struggled to form a coherent response. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Noah barked, stepping around the desk. The letter crumpled further in his grip. "Then tell me, Lila, what is this, a love letter? A plan to run away together?" "It's not like that," she cried, backing away instinctively as he advanced. Her voice broke as she added, "Ethan is just a student. He's trying to help." "Help?" Noah's laugh was cold and humorless. He threw the letter onto the floor and pointed an accusing finger at her. "Is he the reason you've changed? Is he the reason you're distant? The reason you look at me like I'm some stranger?" "Noah, please, you're misunderstanding," Lila pleaded, her back hitting the wall. "I'm not." "Don't lie to me," he roared, his voice shaking the room. He towered over her now, his presence suffocating as he closed the gap between them. "Do you think I don't see it? The way he looks at you, the way you let him? How long has this been going on?" Lila's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "There's nothing going on," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm just tired." "Tired?" Noah spat the word like it disgusted him. "You're tired of me, of this life?" Her silence spoke volumes, and it only fueled his rage. His hand shot out, slamming against the wall beside her, trapping her in place. "Answer me," he demanded, his face inches from hers. Lila flinched, her tears finally breaking free as her composure crumbled. "Yes," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "Yes, I'm tired. I'm tired of being afraid, of walking on eggshells, of feeling like I'm suffocating." Noah recoiled slightly, her words hitting him like a physical blow. His expression shifted. Anger still burned in his eyes, but now it was laced with disbelief. For a moment, the room was silent, save for Lila's ragged breaths. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, her voice quieter now, but no less resolute. "I didn't ask to feel trapped, and I didn't ask for someone like Ethan to remind me what it feels like to be seen." Her confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Noah's hand dropped to his side, but the tension in his body didn't dissipate. His jaw tightened as he took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You think he's your savior?" he asked coldly. "You think he can give you the life I've given you?" Lila didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of her words and the reality of the moment had drained her completely. She slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. Noah turned away, his fists clenching at his sides. The study felt smaller now, suffocating in its silence. He stared at the crumpled letter on the floor, his mind a storm of emotions. But one thought cut through the chaos with chilling clarity. This wasn't over. Not yet. Noah paced the living room like a caged predator, his movements sharp and agitated. The veins in his neck bulged as his breath came in heavy bursts. His face was flushed, a deep crimson spreading from his temples to the tight line of his jaw. The crumpled letter from Ethan sat discarded on the coffee table, a glaring reminder of the storm that had erupted. Lila stood pressed against the corner of the room, her hands gripping the edge of the wall behind her, as though it might somehow hold her steady. Her body trembled, and her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She couldn't meet Noah's gaze, not with the fury radiating from him like heat from a fire. "You think I don't see it?" Noah bellowed, his voice reverberating through the house. His eyes, wild and burning with anger, locked onto her. "You think I don't know what's going on between you and that boy?" "There's nothing going on," Lila managed to whisper, her voice so faint it was almost lost under his tirade. "Don't lie to me," he roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The sound made her flinch violently, her back pressing harder against the wall. "You've been pulling away from me for months, ignoring me, avoiding me, and now I know why. It's him." "Noah, please," she pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's not what you think. Ethan is just..." "Just what?" he interrupted, taking a menacing step toward her. His voice dripped with venom. "Your savior? Your escape? He's a kid, Lila. He can't give you what I've given you." Leela's voice broke as she whispered, "What you've given me is fear." His steps faltered momentarily, her words cutting through the haze of his anger, but only briefly. The muscles in his face tightened as he pointed an accusatory finger at her. "You belong to me," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "Do you hear me? You're my wife, and I won't let you throw this away for some stupid infatuation." Her legs nearly gave out beneath her as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She turned her head away, unable to bear the sight of him in this state. Her voice trembled as she said, "I can't do this anymore." "You don't get to decide that," he snapped, closing the distance between them. His towering figure cast a shadow over her as she cowered against the wall. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me? From everything we've built?" The tears she had been holding back spilled over, streaking her face as her composure crumbled. "It's not a marriage, Noah," she said through sobs. "It's a prison." Before he could respond, the faint sound of footsteps outside the house caught her attention. Her head snapped toward the window, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the dim light filtering in from the street, she saw a familiar silhouette approaching the studio's door. "Ethan?" Her eyes widened in panic as she realized he had heard the shouting. "Noah," she said urgently, her voice shaking. "Please, just stop. Don't make this worse." Noah's head turned sharply toward the window, catching the movement outside. His expression darkened further, his jaw locking as he realized who it was. "That boy," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He doesn't know what he's walking into." "No," Lila cried, stepping in front of him to block his path. "Leave him out of this, please." Noah's eyes bore into hers, his face a mask of fury and contempt. "You want me to leave him out of it?" he said mockingly. "Then you tell him to stay away. You tell him to forget you ever existed. Because if he doesn't..." He leaned closer, his voice dripping with malice. "I will make sure he regrets it." Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding as the reality of his threat sank in. Outside, Ethan hesitated by the door, his hand hovering near the handle. His brow furrowed as he listened to the muffled shouting, his own anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The door remained closed, but the storm brewing inside threatened to tear it down. Ethan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening as he prepared to step into the chaos. The studio felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The door slammed open and Ethan stormed in, his face etched with fury. Noah turned from where he stood, his towering frame casting a menacing shadow over Lila, who was pressed against the far wall. Her tear-streaked face froze at the sight of Ethan, and her heart sank further. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Get away from her!" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling with rage. He stepped between them, glaring at Noah with unbridled hatred. "You don't get to treat her like this. Not anymore." Noah's smirk was a weapon in itself, cruel and cutting. He straightened, exuding the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "What are you doing here, kid?" he asked, his voice calm but dripping with venom. "You think you can save her? You think she wants to be saved by you?" "She deserves better than you," Ethan shot back, his fists clenched at his sides. "She deserves someone who doesn't control her, someone who doesn't make her afraid." Noah took a step closer, his towering presence meant to intimidate. "And you think that's you?" he sneered. "A naive little boy playing at being a man? You don't know a damn thing about what it takes to be with her." Ethan's gaze flicked to Lila, who stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. The sight of her, so small and broken between them, pushed him past the point of reason. His hand shot out, grabbing the violin resting on the nearby table, Lila's prized possession. "No," Layla gasped, stepping forward, but it was too late. With a guttural shout, Ethan smashed the violin against the edge of the desk, the wood splintering in his hands. The strings snapped with a high-pitched twang, and the shattered pieces scattered across the floor. He stood there, chest heaving, holding the broken remains like a declaration of war. "You don't deserve her!" Ethan yelled, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. His eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. Noah's expression darkened, his smirk disappearing. "You little," he began, his voice rising, but he was interrupted by a sudden, piercing scream. "Enough!" Both men froze as Lila's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stepped forward, her body trembling, but her eyes blazing with a fire neither of them had ever seen before. "I can't do this anymore," she screamed, her voice raw and filled with years of suppressed pain. "I can't live like this with either of you." Ethan turned to her, his anger melting into shock. "Lila." "No," she shouted, her hand raising to stop him. "You don't get to fight over me like I'm something to win. I'm not a prize, and I'm done being a pawn in this toxic mess." Her chest heaved as she turned to Noah, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "And you? You don't own me. You never did." The room fell silent, the echoes of her words hanging heavy in the air. Neither man spoke, their faces etched with the weight of her declaration. Lila's shoulders slumped as tears welled in her eyes, but she held her ground. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were shaky but purposeful, each one a small victory over the chains that had bound her for so long. When she reached the door, she paused, looking back at them one last time. "I'm done," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath Noah's shifting weight. He looked down at the shattered violin, his jaw tightening, while Ethan stood motionless, his hands still clutching the broken pieces. The studio, once filled with music and life, now felt hollow, an empty battlefield strewn with the wreckage of their choices. Neither man moved, both of them left to grapple with the echoes of her absence and the pieces of themselves she had left behind. The quiet of the kitchen was almost suffocating as Lila sat at the small wooden table, a blank piece of paper before her. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, each second urging her to write the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen, the ink hesitating on the page before flowing steadily with her thoughts. "Noah, I can't live like this anymore. I've spent too many years trapped in fear, too many nights wondering what I did wrong. I'm tired of feeling small, of feeling invisible. This isn't love, it's control, and I can't be a part of it any longer." She paused, her chest tightening as tears blurred her vision. She wiped them away, forcing herself to continue. "Ethan, you showed me kindness when I needed it most. You reminded me of my strength, of the person I used to be, but I can't let myself depend on you. I have to stand on my own, to find out who I am without anyone else. Thank you for everything, but this is my journey to take alone." Her hand hovered over the page as she signed her name at the bottom. Lila. Just Lila. For the first time in years, no titles, no attachments, just herself. She folded the letter carefully, placing it on the center of the table where Noah would find it. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. A single tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, "Goodbye." Outside, the world was quiet as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lila walked down the empty street, her small suitcase rolling behind her. The cool evening breeze brushed against her face, carrying with it the scent of freedom. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though she were shedding the chains that had bound her for so long. The familiar weight in her chest began to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare her. The faint sound of her footsteps echoed in the quiet street as she stopped at a small bridge, leaning against the railing to watch the sun sink below the horizon. The golden light bathed her face, softening the lines of worry and grief that had marked her for so long. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and allowed herself a moment to simply exist. Weeks later, the soft hum of an intimate audience filled a small theater. The warm glow of stage lights illuminated Lila as she stood center stage, violin in hand. The familiar weight of the instrument against her shoulder felt different now, not as a burden, but as an extension of herself. She drew the bow across the strings, the first note resonating through the room with a purity that brought tears to her own eyes. The melody was raw and unguarded, each phrase carrying a piece of her journey. She wasn't just playing for the audience, she was playing for herself. As the final note lingered in the air, the crowd erupted into applause. Lila looked out at the faces before her, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. A small, genuine smile spread across her lips, her first in years. In that moment, under the warm glow of the lights, she felt it, freedom, and it was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The soft amber glow of a desk lamp filled Ethan's small apartment, casting gentle shadows on the walls lined with shelves of sheet music and books. The air was quiet, save for the faint hum of passing cars outside and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath his chair. Ethan sat in the center of the room, his violin resting delicately on his shoulder. He drew the bow across the strings, letting a single note hum softly before cascading into a bittersweet melody. Each phrase was deliberate, carrying the weight of emotions he hadn't yet found the words for. The music filled the room, resonating in the quiet space as if telling a story all its own. His eyes drifted to the violin as he played, the polished wood gleaming under the light. He thought of Lila, her hands guiding him when he struggled, her smile breaking through the heaviness of her world, and the tears that revealed the depth of her pain. She had been his teacher, his inspiration, and for a fleeting moment, the object of his deepest affection. But now, as the music swelled, he realized she was something more, a lesson he had needed to learn. Love wasn't about holding on. It wasn't about saving someone or being saved in return. It was about seeing someone fully and letting them be who they needed to be. He finished the piece, the final note lingering in the air before fading into the quiet. Ethan lowered the violin and set it gently on the table, his fingers brushing over its surface with a kind of reverence. His chest felt lighter, as though the music had released something he hadn't known he was holding on to. His gaze shifted to the small television in the corner, where the faint glow of a live broadcast flickered across the screen. He reached for the remote and turned up the volume, his breath catching as the camera panned to the stage. There she was. Lila stood beneath the warm stage lights, her violin poised, her posture strong and graceful. She was radiant, her face alight with a calm confidence he hadn't seen before. The audience sat in rapt silence as she began to play, the notes soaring through the air with a purity that brought tears to his eyes. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched her performance. Every movement, every note, spoke of a woman who had reclaimed her power, her identity, and her voice. She was no longer the Lila he had known, weighed down by fear and uncertainty. She was free, and it was breathtaking. As the final note of her piece rang out, the crowd erupted into applause. Lila smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and Ethan found himself smiling too, not with longing or regret, but with pride and peace. He turned off the television, the image of her smile lingering in his mind. He sat back, closing his eyes for a moment as the words formed on his lips, unspoken but deeply felt. Sometimes, he whispered to the empty room, love means setting someone free. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ethan picked up his violin again. He placed it against his shoulder, his fingers finding their positions with ease. This time, the melody he played was different, brighter, filled with hope. It wasn't about Lila or loss or what might have been. It was about him, his growth, and the possibilities that lay ahead. The music carried him forward, each note a step toward something new.